This is Duke University.
So welcome to our Neurohumanities Research Group meeting called Lab Sense of Minds and Magnets with Erin Manning and Brian Massumi and Ralph James Savarese. The Neurohumanities Research Group is co-sponsored by the Duke Institute for Brain Sciences and the Franklin Humanities Institute. And over the last 2 years, it has welcomed such luminaries at the intersection of neuroscience and the humanities as Vittorio Gallese, Stanislas Dehaene, and coming up on April 8th, Catherine Malabou. The Neurohumanities Research Group conveners, which are myself, Lasana Harris, who's here next to me, and Michael Platt, all live a substantial part of our own academic lives in our labs. I'm going to mention the Haiti Lab, which is right next door, and this is a product of the Haiti Lab up here, Haiti History Embedded in Amber, which I think will be pertinent to what we talk about, and the Harris Lab and the Platt Lab. And we've welcomed the leaders of such hybrid spaces as the Story Lab. Angus Fletcher was here from the Story Lab, and the Literary Cognition Lab at MSU, which Natalie Phillips runs. And today we'll be thinking with Erin Manning and Brian Massumi as co-founders of the most prominent of interdisciplinary labs, the Sense Lab, which since 2008 has been exploring the active passage between research and creation about the question of lab sense. What is lab sense? How can we cultivate it? And how can we channel its results into the larger extra lab life of academia? Lab sense is in part what we hope to make more readable in the new Neurohumanities Research Group Global Ed program called Neurohumanities in Paris, which begins this coming summer. We're particularly inspired in our exploration of the interdisciplinary setting of knowledge production by the Erin Manning project Folds to Infinity, as described in her chapter Fiery, Luminous, Scary, which will be in her forthcoming book, Always More Than One, Individuation's Dance, coming out with Duke University Press in January. And Erin Manning is a philosopher, visual artist, and dancer, and currently University Research Chair at the Faculty of Fine Arts, Concordia University in Montreal. She is also, she received her PhD in political science and has been teaching philosophy, political theory, visual studies, cultural studies, and film theory. She migrates around without too much respect for disciplines, which is great. She's a member of the editorial board for the online journal Inflections and the author of works on movement and ephemerality. And she is also the author of Relationscapes, Movement, Art, Philosophy, and also Politics of Touch, Sense, Movement, and Sovereignty. Her other forthcoming book, in addition to Always More Than One, is with Brian Massumi, Thought in the Act, Passages in the Ecology of Experience. And Brian Massumi is a political theorist, writer, and philosopher, currently a professor in the Department of Communication Sciences at the University of Montreal, where he directs both the PhD program and the workshop in radical empiricism, which has been sort of swallowed into the Sense Lab. And he's well known for his translations of several major texts in French post-structuralist theory, including Deleuze and Guattari's A Thousand Plateaus, Lyotard's The Postmodern Condition, and Jacques Attali's Noise. He received both his master's and doctoral degrees in French literature from Yale University, French literature, and completed postdoctoral work at Stanford University. And he's the author of Semblance and Event, Activist Philosophy, and the Occurrent Arts, Parables for the Virtual, Movement, Affect, Sensation, and A User's Guide to Capitalism and Schizophrenia, Deviations from Deleuze and Guattari. And Ralph James Savarese, many of you probably know, he's with us this year as a Humanities Writ Large Fellow and is rapidly transforming our entire environment in neurohumanities. He teaches English at Grinnell College and is a poet, essayist, and literary scholar. And he did the boot camp at DIBS this summer and really knows his neuroscience astoundingly well for a humanist. And this fall he's co-teaching with me in the Flaubert's Brain Neurohumanities course. He has published widely and will be publishing much more widely after the incredible productivity of this semester on cognitive approaches to literature and disability, with articles and forthcoming work on topics including poetry as right hemispheric language, post-colonial neurology, and conjoined neurology. And he is the author of Reasonable People, a memoir of autism and adoption. And with his wife, Emily Thornton Savarese, he is the co-editor of a special issue of the Disability Studies Quarterly. And I'll just mention that his son, Deej, has just received with a director named Rob Roy an ITVS grant for the production of a documentary film representing autism from the perspective of someone who is autistic. And so I just wanted to mention the second half of our title, in which we are exploring today the work of the senses in neurotypical and neurodiverse contexts, is of minds and magnets. And we use this to echo of mice and men, which is to say the most common species represented in lab spaces. And but we're inviting introspection on what the large magnets of brain imaging can translate to us about the mind that we haven't already learned from other technologies and genres. And so we will just welcome our speakers and just jump into our conversation.
So I want to thank Deborah for that subtitle of Minds and Magnets, because the other resonance is, of course, in Erin's artwork and in the piece that Substance published. So I got to know these folks through a fan letter, right? Remember way back when? And then a visit to the Sense Lab with my son, who's a non-speaking person with autism, who's in his first semester at Oberlin right now. And then DJ, my son, collaborated with Erin in forming, making art installations that were somehow about perception, autism, philosophy, clothing, texture, light, evading his parents. I mean, that might have been primary. But what we thought we'd do is begin with a discussion about the Sense Lab, introduce some of you who are unfamiliar with the Sense Lab to that project, ongoing project, and to think about why a lab space might be ideal for thinking through something more radical than the term interdisciplinarity conveys. And so maybe you could begin by telling us something about the origin and development of the Sense Lab, and then eventually we'll get into the visit that we took and the new work on autistic perception, synesthesia, what you call the ineffable amodality of experience from that article. But let's begin with the Sense Lab.
Thank you, Deborah and Ralph. It's great to be here. Strange circles, Montreal students. It's great. And Sense Labber, I should say. So they exist at Duke too. I started the Sense Lab in 2003, and Brian was pretty quick to become a member. I think he came to the third meeting or something, so we consider him an old-timer. And I started the Sense Lab. It was really quite pragmatic in the beginning. I was writing politics of touch. And the further I got into questions of touch, the more I realized I needed to be in conversation with people from different, not only different parts of the institution, but people who were from the community, artists or independent scholars. And I had some concerns that I came from a background that was sort of anti-institutional. I was homeschooled, and so I was sort of concerned about how the university might try to organize my thinking. So it's a bit of a panic gesture as well. Like, how do I fit into the university in a way that allows the university to remain open to its various outsides? And what I can say now in retrospect, and I think what we could say together, because it is now a 9-year history of a lot of work, is that what we couldn't articulate in the beginning, but has become very present for us, is an intuition that there are many kinds of forms of knowledge. And that the predominant form of knowledge within the academy is linguistic knowledge. But Concordia has the largest fine arts faculty in Canada, and so presumably also had an investment in other kinds of knowledge, non-linguistic, artistic forms of knowledge. And with my entry into Concordia, what I had not understood, but also makes sense in retrospect, is that as the first person in the fine arts, in studio arts with a PhD, my entry into the university meant we could do what we call research creation PhDs. So you could do an art-based PhD, which suddenly brought with it all kinds of concerns about how you would be able to evaluate this work that was non-linguistic, to a certain degree, at least half of it. And so very early on, our concerns became, how do you create a context that isn't an exhibition context, so neither a conference context or an exhibition, art exhibition context, where you might find a way to articulate with people from different areas of thought how knowledge is produced.
And well, I guess I should just say a little bit about what brought me there, which was being a misplaced philosopher in a discipline that has a very hard time sustaining its own sense of its disciplinarity, and so overcompensates communications. And I found that that immediate disciplinary surrounding really wasn't conducive to taking the philosophy further, and I felt sort of more and more isolated in that kind of sort of intensely isolated thinking and reading that goes into writing philosophically. And I started wondering what it would mean to have or be part of a laboratory of philosophy. And that's what the Sense Lab provided me. And particularly a laboratory of philosophy that took off from the point of view of radical empiricism, which is the idea that the relations between things are as real, has its own mode of reality as the things in relation, so that if you start from products, you're already sort of cutting in half what you're taking into account, because there's always a field from which those products have been separated out, cut out, and brought into a certain kind of emphasis, a certain kind of relief. So the idea in the Sense Lab, I mean, one of the first things that we really talked about was how to bring people together, not from the point of view of their what they've produced in the products, bringing their results together, but starting back a step before at the level of their process. So the laboratory would have to be thought of as a kind of specific locus that was really creating an open field that wasn't, you know, the doors were porous, the walls were membranes, and it wasn't sort of a closed space that separated itself off. So that we would bring people together in a way that sometimes almost made a ritual of crossing the doors in a way that encouraged them to leave a lot of the baggage about their sense of who they were, the sense of their disciplinary coherence behind, and then starting again, not from zero and not in a completely open field, but from the point of view of what techniques they use when they start, what keeps them going in their process, what's compelling to them in their work and in their lives in relation to the work, and bring that kind of background that usually isn't brought into the academic context into the laboratory in a way where everyone, it's not a clean slate, but everyone is sort of starting from a new starting point, because there's an event underway that that creates certain starting points that everyone is equally in touch with, but each from their own angle. So to activate that diversity in an enactive way rather than simply talking. So always starting through the inaction and then moving into talking and integrating texts and philosophical conversation.
So how about talking specifically about some of the events that you've staged or some of the projects that have emerged as a result of interacting with faculty members, with graduate students, with people from the community in different ways that aren't ordinarily part of a given faculty member's scholarly production?
So what we did is that we began in 2004 by sending out a call. And it was a call for participation that was quite experimental in the sense that we didn't know what it would produce. The call asked people to tell us if they wanted to find a way to come together that was at the level of their techniques or their processes, as Brian was saying. If they did want to do that, and this was sent out very widely, why did they want that? Would this kind of encounter be interesting, and why? And the response was extraordinary. We had such a strong interest, both from very, very established academics and by beginning artists. It was really, really broad. And so what we did was we had it was hard. We had to choose people. We thought at the beginning that we would work with 25. There was no way we could get down to 25, so we accepted 40 people. We took out the people who had the instinct to write in a way that was about their CV. So we thought, well, these people had lots of places to go. So we don't need those people, or they don't need us. But maybe the other places, there were a lot of, I think of, for example, Steve Shaviro, who was part of our events from the very beginning, who said, I'm so hungry for another kind of environment. These were the people we thought, okay, yeah, you're coming. We have to include you. But to use Steve Shaviro, who you may know, as a continuing example, this was, our first event was one of movement, and after 15 minutes, Steve said to me, I have now moved more than I've ever moved in my life. I've had enough movement. And for the next years of movement events, he just kept saying, Erin, remember that first event? I did the moving already, right? So the events were set up in this kind of call, and what we realized, and I should say, we're poor. We have no money. None of this, there was only one event for which we got $20,000. So all of this is people coming on their own account, finding ways to make it work, community in Montreal giving us food, we making food collectively. So none of this is done supported by university money because we create process and not product. We sort of going counterintuitively to funding strategies, right? And so what we did once we had this call is we realized, okay, people have an interest. We had the first event, which was really meant to generate forms of collaboration. So the event was thought of as a sort of pot for generating future events. And what we realized was that everybody wanted to continue. And so over the last 8 years, the events that we've done have continued with almost everybody from that first event and grown from there. And so it would be too long, I'll let Ryan say a few words, it would be too long to go over the 9 years of the events. We've just had one in October, but one of the things that has been really key to our way of functioning is the question of how you can create an event that functions not at the level of reporting. And so, for example, how do you not fall into the trap of that small group to large group shift where you just have reporting strategies? And so a lot of our work has gone into thinking about alternative techniques that don't do that. And I think in that regard, we have been quite successful, not Brian and I, but the whole group, in establishing ways, for example, of holding events. One of our events was in 17 countries at one time, that enhance local forms of collaboration and that the events aren't so much concerned with what is done, what is managed, what kind of products come out of the 4 or 5 or week or 2 week length of the actual meeting, but what takes place over the years of the collaborations that ensue out of them. So we think of the actual events as sort of punctual sort of points of respite from much larger collective sort of activist concerns that happen in the local environments where these where the collaborations begin to take form.
So we sort of measure our success in terms of really what happens in a way beyond the events, the way the events are prolonged by people leading them and perhaps forming collaboration. So it's sort of a centrifugal model. What happens in the events, there's often a sense of incompleteness, sometimes even confusion. There are things that fail. But part of it is learning, over the years has been learning how to work with that and not allow that to become a paralysis. Because there's a lot, if you've successfully germinated something, there's a lot there that needs the time and the other places and that movement out in order to express itself and take a determinate shape. So we think of it as seeding, as sort of sowing seeds of sort of coming determinations rather than defining something. And we realized very quickly that the last thing that does that is complete openness or free association. So or seeking agreement, or even consensus on the process. So we started thinking a lot about what it means to frame an event as opposed to frame a topic, and we came to notions that I think are very close to what are used in structured improvisation, like enabling constraint. So we put a lot of thought into how do you, instead of framing an event, in other words, setting out its limits in advance, defining a territory in terms of content and expected products, how do you create a kind of a surface from which an event that's going to self-organize emergently can lift off? So we started thinking in terms of springboards, or what we call platforms of relation, and use this notion of enabling constraint, where the constraint creates a kind of limitation of the field that creates a focus and the beginnings of a determination, but doesn't predetermine what happens. So we think of it a bit in terms of like how the force of gravity works in dance. I mean, it's a constraint. There's no possible way of getting around it. It's completely predictable. It's completely law-bound. But if you add together certain elements like transversal movement across the vertical plane of gravity, if you've primed the participants with certain interactions, concepts, and ideas, then that moving across in tension with the verticality can create movements, leaps, curlicues in the air that don't defy gravity so much as work with it to do something on a plane of its own, which is the plane of dance, which is an emergent plane from that constraint of the horizontal ground and the vertical force of gravity. So we worked a lot about how to create enabling constraints that are those jumping off points into an emergent activity rather than definitions of what's going to happen.
I'll just give you one quick example. We just had an event called Into the Midst in October, and the concern, as some of you may know, that Montreal has been in great upheaval the last year. We've had the biggest student strike in decades. We had demonstrations every night for months, but also demonstrations that had several demonstrations with 250,000 people at each demonstration, which is probably very close to the population of downtown Montreal. So we're looking at enormous participation for something that, from the neoliberal perspective, would seem extraordinarily demanding: free education. Quebec students already pay lower tuition fees than everywhere else in North America. There's a very particular moment where the students were saying, yeah, so what? We should get worse? Is this really what you're suggesting? I mean, why not opt for something that actually has some imagination, has a vision? And this student strike mobilized the whole imaginary of definitely the city, but I would say also the province and in some ways the country. We had an election. The party in power was voted. The students were successful in not having a tuition hike. Free education is still not quite there, but in the midst of all of this, we decided to do an event that would touch on these kinds of issues around the question of the gentrification of creative capital. And in particular, we were interested in a local community arts organization which had recently been very successful with local government and national government in implementing a next stage of its offerings to the city by building this enormous dome structure that is a 360, it's actually 180, but on their site it says 360-degree projection surface, which is also a sensory surface. So undoubtedly the most advanced projection site in Montreal, which is all fine and well, except that it comes at a strange time in the history of what constitutes culture in a city that is probably, by all accounts, the most cultural city in North America, in the sense that Montreal is simply a cheap place to live full of artists. I mean, it still carries that possibility. And so we saw all of these challenges, and one of the things we wanted to touch on was the fact that this new dome, which costs millions of dollars and is therefore now pay only, I mean, it's got all of these other kind of financial problems with it, is in the red light district in Montreal. So it's also in one of the most challenged areas of the city. And so just to give you an example of a constraint, we always work collectively, as Brian said, so there is no action that isn't explored. So if somebody says, let's try this, we try this. But what we don't do is discuss ad nauseum whether it works or not. If it doesn't work, we just go to the next thing. And so
it's a bit Darwinian in that sense.
it is a bit.
The things that are inviting and that really pique people's interests survive. And others
exactly.
don't.
So as with each of our events, we start a year in advance. We do a lot of reading. We Skype every 2 weeks internationally. We've got people in the Sense Lab across many countries: Australia, Europe, Canada. And so we have these Skypes where we talk about, ideas for the work and so on. But a couple of months before the actual event, some of the people in the network, local people, said, well, why don't we go to the park? There's this park right next to this dome called the Peace Park, which is full of junkies and prostitutes and skateboarders, and ask them how they feel about the dome. And, we'll record this. And it was a total disaster. The people in the park said, yeah, we'll do it for money or drugs. And so the people came back and were like, shit, do we give them drugs? I mean, how do we deal with this constraint? And so this is an example of a total failure. We come back, and then we come up with an idea which actually was really beautiful and it really worked, which was to return to think of this choreographically. So we have a site, we have this large park, it's the fall in Montreal. So what we did was we had a local grocer give us day-old raspberries, strawberries, and blackberries en masse. We had dozens and dozens of the these little strawberry, I don't know what they call it, cartons. And we set them out. We also spent a day collectively. By then, all of the participants had arrived from around the world. We had a day of cooking. So we made lots of red food. And but we played with taste. So we might make like key lime pie, but it was red, or we played with this. And red, so for the red light district, and red was also the color of the strike, the red square. And then we took white yarn and we went into the park and we squished. And I bought white painter's outfits, overalls. And we squished all of the berries and we put all of the yarn in the berries. And meanwhile, if you wanted to come and just take berries or eat food, that's fine. And lots of people did that. And we squished them, and then we put the yarn in, and then we had crochet needles. And we just taught everybody who wanted to learn how to do a simple crochet stitch. And we stayed for about 8 hours. And at the end of 8 hours, the whole park, which is about maybe 10 times the size of this room, had this enormous web. And some people crocheted for an hour, some people for all day, some people for 20 minutes. But it was in this kind of day-long event that was part of another event, the conversations that we couldn't get through the interviews began to happen. And so that's an example of, you know, I think what was a constraint that was really worked choreographically. The movement of the crocheting is very easy movement, and what happens when you crochet is you get closer and closer to the end of your string, so that inevitably people would run into each other. And then you sort of had to decide with that person, do you get scared, in which case if you walk back, you uncrochet your string, or you have to kind of work with them to continue. And so you know, that's an example of something that worked in a recent event. And then there were many others that didn't.
And that sort of illustrates the failure of coming from a subject matter point of view, talking about it on that linguistic level. And I think it illustrates a different kind of approach that can be used that's relational, but in a very particular way, because it's relational sort of in a sense of putting itself in between, but it's always in a kind of field where there's tensions in play. Well, I think of it in terms of attractors. There's the attractor of the dome, but only certain people are allowed in and can use the dome. There's the attractor of the park, but it's an attractor often for skateboarders or for drug users, and it has a very, very particular, very troubled presence in the city. And there's a gradient between the two, and there's regimes of passage or non-passage between the two. So you can try to create a point of encounter that happens between, that's not ignoring that tension, but in a sense it's almost focusing it by the contrast of the encounter that's been able to take place. So we think in terms of different sort of, rather than relating between things or between people interpersonally, between systems that are in tension, just like the system of gravity and the system of physiology of the body and the system of expectations of inherited from the history of dance. So we always try to find these points that sort of trigger all of the complexity of the field, but at a point of unexpected encounter that also suggests that maybe there's other ways, other regimes of passage. So in the Dome event, we were not only thinking about the relationship between the technological arts as part of the new creative economy, as part of a new redevelopment of the red light district to become what they call a show quarter, the quartier des spectacles. But because that you can very easily fall into, and you have to analyze, you have to understand a bit about the history of the site, you have to go out and see who's there. There's sort of an empirical, there's sort of an analytical and an empirical in the traditional sense part of that. But that's just some of the material that it moves from. So you always try to add something else that is in tension with that, that belongs to another system and work between. So in the Dome event, we were thinking about what happens when you do go in and you have this massive, very compelling screen in a dark room, and you can have an interactive experience, but it's more like a game environment or a virtual reality space often. And even when the projection space is trying to give you a simulation of depth or of movement, you're interacting with the surface, and you never really get beyond that feeling of interacting with the surface. So our question was, what are the implications of putting a body in that space, pacifying it or activating it in an action-reaction mode on a game model? And is there a way of activating the in-between space or the floor space in a way that interacts, where there's a kind of modulation of what you're feeling proprioceptively, for example, by the vision, so that there's this, across those scales, something else happens that changes spectatorship into something else. But then, how do you put that into relation to all the problems of that differential between inside and the outside? How do you bring people into that? And so it's actually quite a difficult problem that I don't think we solved, and I think in a lot of ways that event was a failure. But just being able to pose those problems and come to a few little techniques that can create points of encounter can feel like a huge
And this is what really interests me. And when I first wrote you, I've been working for years on what I call autistic perception. And I remember writing to you and saying that some of the things that you are talking about with these events in both a kind of philosophical and an aesthetic way actually mirror or mimic not only aspects of autistic perception, but also innovative therapies that have, for example, strived to help autistics with sensory integration. So let me make this really concrete. So our family's pretty well known for having taught our son, who was labeled severely mentally retarded, how to read on a trampoline with the netted enclosure, stringing words on the netted enclosure. Erin's jumped on this trampoline as vigorously as anybody I have ever seen. I have a whole indoor trampoline house where the trampoline's level with the floor. That's another story. But in any event, the point here is that what would it mean to read while you move, or to learn to read while you move? What would it mean to coordinate a sensory environment, a linguistic environment, an affect environment? Because of course we were also, I would tackle my son, we would wrestle. We were trying to think outside of the box in terms of dynamic ways of integrating sensory modalities. And as most people know, that one of the great paradoxes about autism, classical autism, is that there's a very high rate of synesthesia, but at the same time, there's tremendous difficulty with integrating the senses. So on one level, you've got a kind of perfect integration. On another level, for example, my son, even to this day, he might scream if you washed his hair, but he could down a whole thing of Tabasco sauce with no registration. So, and this is quite common, you'll get hyper and hyposensitivity in the same body. And initially you're thinking, look at this synesthesia. They do automatically, to an extent, what artists are trying to stage quite deliberately. But on the other hand, it's this business of coordinating things. And let me, again, make this even more specific because it relates to the piece you wrote for Substance and the visit to the Sense Lab. So there are pretty good studies that show that autistics have far superior perceptual hearing of speech sounds and far inferior semantic hearing of those sounds. And the inverse is true, that neurotypicals have very poor perceptual hearing of speech sounds, but terrific semantic, right? And I'm really interested in the folks, especially with this label of severe autism, who have managed to do what I call neurocosmopolitanism, this business of still retaining a proclivity, a sensory proclivity of hearing the sound aspects of language, but also moving into the possibility of using meaning. But it's a very different kind of meaning. It's much more akin to the way meaning, let's say, emerges out of a poem, as opposed to, in fact, I remember, to the day I die, I will remember when my son really coming into language like crazy, 3rd or 4th grade. He types out on his computer, how come you all don't ask for a glass of water in an interesting way? And I just was absolutely stunned out of my mind, like, oh my God, we're so instrumental. Like, we just created these domains separate from life, in which it is okay to dress up language or make it do more or make it feel more, but in everyday life, maybe not so much. I don't want to create a binary, but I do think this is one of the things that comes out of your new book from Duke, is what you also call autistic perception, is this amodal, fluid movement. And then how can that be, not exactly a metaphor, but a kind of homology for staging knowledge production, so that knowledge production is coming out of multiple sites that can't even necessarily be reconciled neatly.
Yeah, no, I mean, DJ is the most amazing kid, and jumping on that trampoline was definitely a highlight of my life. But I think that's why I said, in retrospect, I can see that so much of the work of the Sense Lab has been about the exploration of other forms of knowledge that are very much in question today, not so much around autism, but around these art-based PhDs. So I think that, politically speaking, at least in the Canadian context, but I suspect all over the world, we're in a position where academia is having to rethink how it evaluates knowledge. Because as soon as you say a PhD doesn't need to be a written document, you have the problem of how do you know that this is good work? And this has, having been on a number of those committees, both in Canada and in the UK, I know that this is a thorny question. And when I met DJ, one of the things that really stood out for me was that he was able, not only DJ, but other autistics similar to DJ on that classical spectrum of autism, were capable of being articulate about forms of knowledge that are that cross that span of the linguistic, of the pre-linguistic, and so on. And one of the ways that I find it easy to explain, which comes from, is a description by Anne Corwin, but in all of their ways, Frank Bissonnette, DJ, Tito, etc., they all say this, is that neurotypicals, which, by the way, if it's not clear, is an insult to us. Neurotypicals have a tendency to spend all their time chunking. This is Anne's vocabulary. So what she means by this is that when we go into an environment, it's already constituting itself into humans and non-humans and floors and walls and chairs and backgrounds and foregrounds and so on. Neurologically speaking, we know that this is not immediate in our perception. We know that there's at least a half-second lag between the edgings into perception and the perceptual contours that form objects, for example. But what is particular about autistics is that it's much longer than a half second. In some cases, could even be 5 minutes. And so so Anne Corwin says, you know, you criticize me for not sitting on a chair, but I haven't even seen the chair yet.
Right,
so give me a break. You know?
So Tito says famously, you know, it takes a long time. They see way too much irreducible particularity. Yeah. And so they see that particularity and they've got to work up from the details. I mean, even Temple Grandin says this business of the problem of generalizing is, well, I've seen 50 different streets and I'm really seeing what distinguishes those streets and which makes this business of saying street or using street. It's not that they don't understand what concepts do for us, it just seems like too much of a violation of this kind of perceptual mode. But Tito literally has to piece together. My son said to Sanjay Gupta in an interview, the words come late. And by that he means not that he doesn't have words, it's that words do this business of chunking on the smallest level, and then we keep chunking.
So just to sort of, you know, arc that thought, what this means is that the modes of knowledge that we foreground, for example, in the university, in my opinion, have to be questioned in regards to how quickly the chunking is assumed. And in fine arts context, every studio class is about teaching the students not to chunk so quickly. I mean, you know, you look at art education, it's about don't think you know what you're seeing. Take the time to, you know, draw the relation. I mean, we say this to students all the time. But to what degree is this question a viable and important question in all disciplines? To what degree, when we're teaching a novel, are we actually asking the students to make the words come late? And so, in a sense, the work that I've done with Ralph and with Autism has also made me realize that all of these earlier techniques that we were creating at the Sense Lab were techniques, in effect, to slow down, not to underestimate the force of language. Of course not. It's philosophy we're doing as well. But to say how it comes is as important to what comes in terms of the creation of knowledge. And this how of learning, because we go across modalities, we may have an event that focuses a lot on movement, so the philosophers are out of their realm, or we may have an event that focuses a lot on philosophy, so that the visual artists are out of their realm, or whatever, that all of us are out of our realm in one place or another. And again, coming back to this autistic work, what I hear from DJ and Tito and all of these people is we're out of our realm. This is our daily experience. You made the realm so tight that we don't even know how to quite fit into it I don't know, Brian probably wants to say
Yeah, I just wanted to say something about the concept of autistic perception that Erin develops in All is More Than One as something that is actually a sort of subtends experience across the neurodiversity spectrum. So it's not the perception of autistics, but a mode of perception that is perhaps more singularly experienced by autistics, but that actually it's sort of a ground of perception for everyone on spectrum, which is everyone.
That's the advantage of the spectrum.
And I just wanted to say a few things about that in relation to particularity and synesthesia. I think it's important to start thinking about different terms for that kind of emergent experience. You first think about it in terms of a background, but that doesn't really do it because a background is already assuming the contrast with something that's been chunked and stands out, and the background often loses its character to the profit of to the characteristic of what stands out from it. So the background figure relation is part of the neurotypical chunking. So what we're talking about is a field from which both background and what stands out from the background come. So how can you think about that field? So when Temple Grandin says, I see 50 streets, but I see their particularity, I mean, she's recognizing the streets. There's some thread going through. But if I could...
It's not congealing.
It's not congealing, but I think the really important point is it's not undifferentiated. It's not just a mess. Right. I think what makes this each street, I would say singular rather than particular, is that it could be a different time of day. The reflections, Tito and Padai talk so much about reflections and light effects. And a reflection or a light effect is the way one part of the field is taking account in itself for another part of the field. It's a relational, it's sort of a cross relation. And I think, I mean, if I could use the analogy with poetry, I think that means that the detail is not lacking, but the detail is completely fused with a kind of globality of experience that usually announces itself affectively, as an affective tonality that is like what the feeling of this street at 6 o'clock in the afternoon, or that's a feeling of well-being that might come with that quality of light as it's reflecting through the objects in the field. But that affective global effect is sort of something that is emergent and it's on its own level. In the field, I think that there's that kind of very complex interconnecting that I can only call a fusion without loss of detail, because the details are completely embedded in it and the global effect would happen without them. So it's neither a whole nor the details. And in like reading a poem, if you hear a poem being read, being recited, you're in that movement, and you're really in that kind of scintillating of what the words bring forth. It's often a very physical, often even a proprioceptive feeling, and you're not hearing the individual words. No, you're hearing the movement of the words.
Can I read that poem by Tito?
Yeah.
Because, so Tito's never been allowed, he's got 4 books, he's 23, never been allowed in a regular school. He said famously to an interviewer, my school is the doubt in your eyes. I mean, he literally types aphoristically. And so I started doing tutorials with him, where this whole year we're reading Moby Dick on Friday nights by Skype, 2 chapters at a time. But here's just a little poem called Orange. And this, I think, brings forth what Brian is talking about, the way each element has been infused with the other, so that there's something way beyond the words. And it's a very simple poem. Orange. It was orange as always when I heard the wind. Orange it is, the sound of wind in spring. It made the branches swing. It colored every little thing. It smelled in orange, that sound of wind in spring. Orange it is, as always, the sudden wind. It kept on getting wilder. It's orange on everything. And it's that what I wonder about is, why is it that poetry almost becomes a kind of that's the place where we do this fusing. That's the place where we ask for not just the senses to be synesthetic, but for ideas to be synesthetic, for everything you do, language needs to be synesthetic. But why is that the domain? Going back to sort of DJ asking me, why do we not ask for water in an interesting way? Why is it that we have these separate domains? And I mean, in part, the reason why I became interested so much in what you all are doing is that you want to move that impulse out of a safe, almost patronizing, precious context. Historically arrived at context for art, where it's okay to do that, where that's encouraged. But elsewhere it seems inappropriate.
Yeah, and I think we're always moving in between those, because if you were discussing or in ordinary language or wanted to write a summary of that poem, it's not that you hadn't heard the words, you'd be able to pick out separate words, but when you separate wind from the orange, you've lost the poem, and you've chunked it, and you're able perhaps to hinge an interpretation around wind, but 50 other people could do it differently as well.
Right.
So I think what's so compelling is that this has much, much more than what can be chunked, held together, co-implicated between the details and between the level of detail and the global level.
Right.
So it's this sort of intrication, and then we're always moving out of that into a chunking that, for example, chunks out an object which can be affordance for touch, or it chunks out something on a screen that can be affordance for vision, where there's a dominance of one sense or the other, and that's it. And so we're not saying that we have, like, the free association approach might be to go back into that field and stay there.
Right.
But what we do is saying we do want to go back to the level of determination, but maybe we want to add new objects that haven't been in the world before, or new thoughts, and we want that to be a creative process that is completely coming out of the movement and can go back into it because it doesn't cut its roots to it, and that research can operate that way.
Should we open?
Yeah, just one thing before, I know we had to open, just because you may not know Ralph's work, I just wanted to say that there's a link to poetry that Ralph didn't say, which is really interesting. But Ralph writes about auti-type. So across the globe, when classical autistics come to language, which usually, not always, but usually happens quite late in adolescence. There are examples of it happening earlier, but what they do is that they write in a rhythm that is poetry immediately. So unmediated, their writing is poetic writing. And I say across the world because recently Doug Bicklin and Frank Bissonette and who else?
Alberto Fregone,
right.
Lucy Blackman.
So they made a film called Jabbers.
Oh, Wretches and Jabbers. You're talking about Tracy Thresher and Larry.
Yeah. So they made this film where they traveled the world. They went to to India, and they went to Japan, and they went to Finland, and all of the kids on this film also have a rhythm in the writing that is...
Whether it was Finnish or
whether
whether
it didn't
was
matter.
Japanese.
And so there's no question that there is this kind of entry into language with autistics that is immediately poetic. And so what Ralph was getting at with Tito and what he's talked about in his own writing is that one of the great sadnesses about this link to poetry is that these are kids who haven't had the opportunity to be schooled in any way. Right. They're so amazing without any schooling. Imagine what they could do given a bit of instruction. And instead of being told that their writing was just strange.
Well, think about what Larry said when we were at that MIT conference. So he's just had the movies come out, and he gets up there and he types out something like your lipstick words of appreciation, yes. Movie star me. And he's one of these folks that has not entirely figured out conventional syntax. And there's a spectrum. But his sense of embodied, it's like in order for them to think linguistically, the embodied prompt needs to remain. In fact, this year, I was telling you guys this earlier today, 2012, a study on textual metaphor showed that even a cliche like I had a rough day activates the somatosensory cortex, whereas I had a bad day did not. And he's a neuroscientist at Emory, and he speculates that in accordance with some of the work that's come out on metaphor, that the more novel the metaphor, the more vigorous the activation should be in the somatosensory cortex. It's really, really interesting. It's that somehow neurotypicals don't need my theory is they don't need the embodied prompt or preservation when they're doing things that they already know linguistically. But when the language or thought expands, it's sort of like an acrobat or somebody out there on a tightrope or climbing the Empire State Building. They need more of the original embodied ground of language.
So you're saying neurotypicals are flat-footed?
Yes. But we should open this up. We should open this up.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.